Okay, can you all hear me? Is all right? A very good morning to you all here at La Fable and also you who are following us online. And a very special welcome, I would say, to another physical breakfast meeting hosted by Civita. It's been a long time since we had a physical meeting like this, but we are very happy about that. And I should also say that we are hosting this in cooperation with the Konrad Adenauer Foundation from Germany. My name is Lars Peter Nordback and I will be moderating this meeting on one of the most contested issues in public debate, not only in this country but in many other countries, around the issue of what role should the state play in the economy, and may I add also, particularly in an innovation-driven economy. Market economy. And let me also mention that this meeting takes place just 3 days after a launch of a book called Questioning the Entrepreneurial State, co-edited by one of our panelists. I'll come back to that. And this is a collection of critical analysis of top-down, state-led innovation and industrial policies by a group of international innovation scholars and economists. So this book will actually be some kind of a takeoff point for the discussion in the panel and the meeting as well. So that's what we're going to explore and exchange views about with the help of our excellent panel. So let me start straight away with introducing the panel and start with the co-editor and co-author of the book I just mentioned. This is Christian Sandström, who's here. Christian is assistant professor at the Jönköping International Business School, and he's also a researcher at Ratio Institute in Stockholm. And next to Christian is Jan Schnellenbach, who is professor of economics from Brandenburg University of Technology in Germany. Jan has not been co-authoring or co-editing the book I mentioned, but he has indeed been participating in the German debate on industrial policies, which was really ignited, I think, a couple of years ago with a publication by the former government on national economic industrial strategies 2030. He'll come back more about that. And last but not least, Maria Berg Reinertsen, Norwegian economist, author, and economics commentator at Morgenbladet in Norway, as many of you will know. So before we get started, we'll soon do, a few words about the order of the day. What we will do is we'll start with a presentation from each of the panelists for about, I would say maximum 10 minutes, make sure about that, and followed by a discussion with the panel, inside the panel, around some central questions and themes that we will raise. And then eventually we will also open up for questions from the audience, from you, and also from those who are following us online. And with the help of some colleague of mine, we'll make sure that relevant questions will have a fair chance of being aired during that session. And we'll close it all up with a final round of closing comments by the panel, and we will end the meeting at 9:15 sharp, so you can plan your day accordingly. Well, so without further ado, I kindly ask Christian to prepare and start your presentation. So please, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lars Peter, and thank you to the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung and to Civita for inviting me here and for organizing an event around this important topic. I turned on my clock here, so make sure I'm no more than 10 minutes here. So I'll start with a brief introduction and sort of how we got into this. The book now is... So we're just editors, me and Professor Carl Wennberg at Stockholm School of Economics, and we gather in total 32 scholars from around the world, but mostly Sweden, to be honest. to take a serious look at the idea of an entrepreneurial state, and that's why we call it Questioning the Entrepreneurial State. We have 16 different chapters looking into various aspects of it, and I'll try to look at it from a broader point of view. Now, rethinking economic policy is something we tend to do when we run into a deep recession, that if you look historically, and the financial crisis was one such event by 2008, 2009, and I think policymakers were struggling, and as interest rates were coming down and massive stimulus in all the Western world, and it sort of didn't pay off in the way we wanted it to. And policymakers were desperate, looking for answers. And there, Mariana Mazzucato's idea of the entrepreneurial state came in as an intriguing and quite simple argument, saying that, well, it isn't about rolling back the state. The state has actually had an important role in triggering, in pursuing large leaps into innovation and economic development. So we were, in fact, going in the wrong direction. So that was the argument back then. And again, policymakers were looking for answers. And these answers were giving, I think, policymakers, government officials, a sense of importance and a sense that they can do something. And then they started to do these things. So organizing the economy around missions and for instance, setting up something around, let's say we want to address climate change, and then let's organize some sort of mission around this and let different players in society, academia, large firms, small firms, tap into this and try to accomplish this renewable development. So this was the overarching idea, and it sounds, I think, appealing when you listen to it. I guess the reality becomes more complex and it becomes more problematic when you start to dig into how this is to be done in reality. Because if you look at the Swedish example and many other cases, so you are to define that mission in one way or another. Let's say it's zero carbon CO2 emissions. Okay, how are you to accomplish that? Nuclear, hydro, electric cars, ethanol cars, wind power. These are many different solutions, and these solutions are always competing with each other. So who's going to win that competition? It becomes a political contest for resources. Now, what you see increasingly is large public grants being available for these kind of contests. So Swedish government would have several billions that you can apply for as a sort of free money to engage in innovation, right? And from there, the presence of large free money for firms to apply for towards, okay, who's going to get that money? And how are they going to get that money? That becomes a political process, a political allocation of resources where, you know, are small or large firms going to be more or less likely to obtain that pool of money? And there we see that this is, in reality, it easily ends up with industrial policy and support to large firms. And the large firms of today, the giants of today, are not necessarily the giants of tomorrow or the ones we want to be the giants of tomorrow. So there is this apparent risk that the presence of these large pools of government funds for innovation actually just sustain and entrench the current order of things. Now, that wasn't the intention to start with, but that becomes the outcome of it. And related to this, we have another issue. Now, if you start to have pools of money you can start to apply for, there is actually, to be honest, a slippery slope here of how you apply for this money, who you get to know, the networking around it, and you're bordering towards what in reality becomes corruption. Now, that sounds very cynical to say, but you look at the Swedish example in the 2000s, and we've had a collection of cases where you have engaged in these large-scale attempts at accomplishing sustainable development, which have only resulted in what we refer to as green bubbles. We had a bubble in ethanol cars. Why do we have so few electric cars in Sweden compared to Norway? We had huge efforts by the government in the 2000s to shift the economy to ethanol cars. Relatedly, we were trying to make ethanol out of cellulose, that is, the forest. So we're going to take trees up in the rural north and turn into ethanol. And it became lättöl at best. You know, it was very, very difficult technologically to do this. So if you think of it, this is what actually happened up north, where they applied for and obtained massive amounts of money. And you had one subsidy entrepreneur, and the term here I think is key, subsidy entrepreneur. These are firms that systematically engage in applying for government money and then making things with it. So one of these subsidy entrepreneurs, he was referred to as Ethanol Jesus because he was preaching the gospel of ethanol, not only in Sweden but around the world. And he was referred to as the main advisor to the Ministry of Enterprise back in those days from the Center Party. So this is crony capitalism in a sense, that he got the ear of the minister, managed to obtain large pools of money, and this eventually blew up into a disaster, a scandal with corruption in Sweden over the coming years, and 3 billion in debt in a small, rural, depopulated area of a couple of municipalities in Sweden. So, you know, he was the Zlatan of subsidy entrepreneurship, Ethanol Jesus. And the problem here is that when people are committed and they are capable, really good engineers, and they really want to accomplish sustainable development, and this is the outcome that we get, then we shouldn't blame the people, but we need to look at this system and the overarching ideas that underpin this model, and we need to take a serious look and question it. Now, unfortunately, we haven't done so in Sweden or in the European Union. The European Union, with its Green Deal, has 1,000 billion euros, which is pretty much up for grabs in the same way. And you got 430 billion euros specifically devoted to hydrogen gas here, which is the complete opposite of the economist recommendation: do not pick winners, be technology neutral. Now, what is that money, those 430 billion, what's that going to do with firm behavior? It's going to create a fertile soil for more subsidy entrepreneurship. And the sad story is there's been no sustainable development from it. It's been green bubbles being blown out of proportion and then crashing down, taxpayers paying for it again. And that's the sad reality of it. And now I have 20 seconds left, and I'll leave it right there. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much, Christian. I think we'll go straight to Jan straight away. Please.
Yes, thank you, Lars-Peter. I would like to add some comments from a political economy perspective and from a particular German perspective on the issue. And I'm very much in agreement with Christian that the concept of the entrepreneurial state, of mission-oriented policymaking, is very much lacking any theory of policymaking. It's lacking a theory of how the process of policymaking does actually look like. And that means that many problems that occur in actual policy making simply don't take place in this theory. Problems like rent seeking, problems like regulatory capture, where you have the people that should be regulated colluding with the regulators, and the people who should be supervised colluding with those who supervise and who hand out the grants to them, and Christian already mentioned that. There are also some other problems there from a behavioral perspective. If you look at it from a perspective of behavioral economics, of behavioral political economy, there are many fallacies, behavioral distortions that might lead to resources not being used in a very efficient way once you have this mission-oriented approach, this entrepreneurial state approach, where the government hands out large sums of money to market participants. For example, there's the problem of soft budget constraints. You might find it reasonable ex ante to allocate a certain fund to research on a certain issue, on a certain topic, and then you hand out the money. But once you've handed out the money, you're heavily invested in this project. And if you're heavily invested in this project and also politically heavily invested in this project, you find it very difficult to abort this project, even if it turns out to be a failure, even if the prospect is that it will be a failure. So you hand out even more money, and you keep the project going because you don't want to admit failure. And this comes in close collusion with the Sun Coast Fallacy, which is a fallacy of decision-making very well established in behavioral economics, where you simply keep on going because you have invested a lot of sunk costs and you don't want to give up these sunk costs that you already have invested, and you keep on going and going even if the project fails. There's the opportunity cost fallacy. Once you are heavily invested in one project, you fail to see other opportunities that emerge in time. You might be invested in a certain technology, and somewhere else, a different alternative technology emerges that it becomes better, and you fail to acknowledge this because you're invested in this technology and you don't want to give it up. So you have this problem of opportunity costs. Also, a central concept in Mazzucato's entrepreneurial state and mission-oriented policymaking is the notion of public value. And it's a nice notion, it sounds good. Who would say something against creating public value? But what is actually public value? It's not very well defined what public value could be in this concept. And essentially, it's what maybe in a Hayekian way you could call a weasel word. It's something that you can fill with any meaning that you like to fill it with, and you can support any policy you'd like to support by claiming that it creates some sort of public value. And it's really a very open, not very well defined concept. So there are several problems from a political economy perspective. If I had more time, there could be many more that I could tell you about, like distorted risk perceptions in the general public, so that reasonable technologies don't get the political support they deserve because the general public has some sort of distorted perceptions of risks associated with these technologies. Think of nuclear power, of course. It's very difficult to see how we can actually get an efficient, undistorted allocation of resources from the entrepreneurial state, from mission-oriented innovation policy making. There's no reason to believe that this will actually be efficient. Now, the second point I'd like to make is more from a particular German perspective, which is that the innovation policy that you pursue always needs to fit the general industrial model, the growth model of the country you are in. And if you look at Germany, for example, we have an industrial model, a growth model that rests on so-called hidden champions, a concept coined by a German economist called Hermann Simon a while ago. And hidden champions are very successful firms that basically nobody knows about, but that dominate the niche markets that they are successful in. For example, in 2015, Tim Cook of Apple visited Gerstenhofen, a small town in southern Germany. And you might wonder, what did Tim Cook do in Gerstenhofen in southern Germany? Actually, he visited the supplier of a very specialized glass supplier who provided all the glass for the building front of the new Apple headquarters in Cupertino. And actually, there's this firm in southern Germany, in Gerstenhofen, where whenever an architect has some strange idea of very strangely formed glass in a building front he wants to build, this architect will go to Gerstenhofen and ask this firm to provide the glass for this front, because they have specialized in providing this very specialized product. They can basically produce any type of glass you would like to have. But nobody knows them. But of course, the owners are billionaires, so we have this landscape of very specialized niche producers, hidden champions, with very decentralized knowledge. And it's very difficult to see how a mission-oriented policy could centralize all the knowledge about research activities that you need to come up with innovations in this hidden champions industrial landscape. So that simply doesn't fit the industrial landscape you have. And the third point, maybe, to wrap up, is a success story that some proponents of mission-oriented policymaking try to sell as a success story of mission-oriented policymaking. And that's vaccine production. If you look at BioNTech, a German firm, successful producing COVID vaccines, that's actually entirely a private success story, almost entirely. They have received a bit of government funding in the process of coming up with this innovation for research projects, but that's minuscule relative to the venture capital invested by the Strüngmann family office, 180 million actually. And this Strüngmann family office, which has invested in BioNTech, has had the patience to wait 13 years for the first profits to come out of this firm. And no policymaker would ever have had the patience to wait 13 years for profits to come out of this project. So that's an example of determined, risk-friendly investors in BioNTech supporting this project. And it's not actually a success story of mission-oriented policymaking. And also, if you look at the basic research behind this, it's a story of researchers in universities and research institutes fighting uphill battles for funding against bureaucrats and against state decision makers to support the development of this mRNA technology. So it's something that doesn't fit the story of mission-oriented policy making at all. Okay, so that's my 3 points, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much, John. And we go straight to Maria. Floor is yours, please.
Thank you. Yes, good morning, if it's still morning and it's still good. I think, first of all, this book that we are supposed to discuss today, that's not only that we could call a sort of anti-book for Mariana Mazzucato, maybe. I think that is a very timely book, Christian. As the state now takes a bigger and more direct role in the economy, maybe not by choice, but by necessity, during the corona crisis, the energy crisis unfolding today, and the looming climate crisis and the green transition, it's also very important to discuss how it does that and the merits of the theories underpinning this approach. All right, and I completely agree with your book, Christian, that there are several problems with mission-oriented policy that Mariana Mazzucato has proposed. And maybe the most important thing is that it's very difficult to get hold of what is actually this mission-oriented policy. And there you have, when you read different Mazzucato reports or books, it is a little bit, it is very different kind of missions she describes and very different kind of politics. For example, you have she have a report about the Norwegian economy that has been called the Green Giant, and there she proposes to, among other things, she proposes Norway to the Norwegian state to buy the whole of Equinor and take it off the stock market and use it as a instrument for the green transition. And that's something quite different from what she proposes in her last book, the Mission Economy, a Moonshot Guide to Change, where she proposes, where one of her missions is a mission about creating 100, I think, carbon-neutral cities in EU in the next 10 years. And that's something quite different, okay? Prescribing, giving a prescription for buying a company and using that company, or this more open mission, creating 100 carbon neutral cities, where you can think that you can use, when you can have tenders, and which is much more inclusive kind of mission and much more open. So that's one thing I think is important when we are going to understand how we use this mission economy, that we have to decide what kind of missions are we actually, what do we mean with a mission economy. And one other thing that I want to highlight that I think is very relevant in the Norwegian discussion is what you point out, the risk of that the most powerful and resourceful businesses of today will capture the process in such private-public partnerships or missions that Mazzucato also describes. And we have an example in Norway, I think, that most of you will know about, and maybe you have heard about, when the state and Equinor together tried to make a carbon capture facility at Mongstad. And that is generally regarded as a failure. And one reason for the failure, as the evaluation pointed out, was that the state took most of the risk and left little for private stakeholders. All right. And I myself, I fear that the decision to go for electrification of the Norwegian oil platforms or giving them electricity will be maybe a similar kind of failure when we regard it from 10 years from now. It's something that obviously makes sense from the perspective of oil companies, but it's not so sure that this is the way that we should use our money and our power. If we see it in a broader innovation perspective, is green oil, is that obvious that is what we should do? Okay. So that was the prize for your book, and if you should have a discussion, I think I should come with some questions as well. And I think that Mariana Mazzucato, the problem with her approach, I think, is that she picks some successful examples of innovation, public-led innovation, and then she used that and says that, okay, what can we learn from that? That's okay, that's a good starting point, but she doesn't have any control group. She doesn't ask, well, let's try to compare the innovation in the US, where you had this state-led mission to send people to the moon, and in Germany at the same time in the 50s and 60s, where you didn't have any state missions, you didn't try to put people on the moon, okay? Your book, Christian, are concerned with the failures, mostly. And that also poses some problems, I think, or leaves some questions. First of all, taken together, all the chapters, it seems to me that your critique is not just a critique of the mission economy or the entrepreneurial state, but more a critique of state interventionist politics in general. You could think it's of subsidies, it is of what you here call free money, or research grants, or venture capital, state providing venture capital in general. And at the same time, you pay little attention, I think, to other kind of state interventions. For example, should the state create the market for green solutions? How should the state go about when the green economy or the new economy needs the infrastructure? Should the state stay back then, or should it it's difficult for the state maybe to do. The state have to have some thoughts about, should we go for electric cars, or should we go for more denser cities and people living, or should we maybe building out the railroad system? And how should the state think and approach this question? So that's something I miss, because I think that if you want to challenge Mazzucato, you have to try to give better answers to the questions she are actually answering for the politicians. I don't think that the politicians go to Mazzucato because they really want to be communists or or run everything. I think they go to Mazzucato because they see that we have some problems with the green transition today. What we have done this last 30 years, the economists have told us, okay, we have to tax carbon, put the price of carbon, and we have tried this for 30 years, and here we are, and we are still very long from the goals we have set for our green transition, okay? And so I miss a discussion here on the alternative approaches. If not mission economy, what role should the state play in the green transition? If the answer is taxes and putting a price on carbon, I think you have to look at what happens now. We see the consequence with higher gasoline prices and energy prices. We see that it's very difficult to get support for this. And how should you go about creating more support for this? And if the answer is pricing carbon, you must also discuss, I think, the tax level needed, what would be the consequence of this tax level for employment and distribution and innovation and the standard of living. And so in short, you need you need some better answers to when it comes to the alternatives. And I look forward to hear your thoughts about that. Yes.
Thank you very much, Maria. And I think we had a round of introduction now that takes up many important issues. And I think the last challenge by Maria should probably be the first point of departure. I would like to address Christian and Jan. Did you have any response to that challenge of Maria?
I can start there a bit. When you edit a book and you compile something, in a sense, you have to pick your fight. So you have to focus on trying to deal with one thing. And looking back now, I agree that those questions we should have perhaps gone further with, and we need to. So I appreciate that encouragement. We do so in the introduction a bit, and then towards the end. And I think one question that is also sort of hanging out there in the room is, but what about Sweden? You're pointing out these horror stories about subsidy entrepreneurship in the rural north, and it's perceived as the innovation engine of Northern Europe, you know, with Stockholm and unicorns and Spotify and what have you. How do you combine those stories, Christian? They don't really rhyme very well. And one important part here, I think, is that there have been a lot of improvements to the general conditions for setting up and running enterprises in Sweden over the past 30-year time period. So corporate taxation was 50% in Sweden in 1990. It's 20% today. Taxes on owning businesses today in Sweden are quite low, actually, and they're very low compared to taxes on being employed. So effectively, you have created very strong incentives for entrepreneurial ventures. That'll be one thing. Second, Sweden made big, major, broad, sweeping investments in IT infrastructure, fiber optics, education, tax-deductible personal computers in the 1990s, effectively creating higher IT awareness. So these policies worked, and that's the reason you have this Swedish unicorn success story, which is really a Stockholm thing. The area where it has not worked is where you have put these entrepreneurial state, large, sweeping ambitions towards sustainability into place, and you've seen this massive opportunistic behavior. We had a piece in Dagens Nyheter on this Monday when the book was launched, and we got a reply from the largest industry association in Sweden, and they said, well, we disagree with you. This has actually worked very well for us, these support systems. And we go like, yeah, and that's the problem, right? Okay, I should stop there.
Jan, would you add anything to that challenge we started with?
Yes. I mean, there are basically, I think, two perspectives there. One is the perspective of the question how to enhance general preconditions and general support for innovations. And there, of course, you can do a more broad horizontal innovation policy with tax deductions for research and development, with a very good education system, with providing good basic research and things like that, all these horizontal policies. And I think they are also quite successful. If you look at the empirical literature there, it generally works. And then there's the problem of solving specific problems, like dealing with climate change and reducing CO2 emissions and having this specific problem. And that's where this mission-oriented approach always comes in, where Mazzucato defines some certain mission that needs to be solved. But if you look at these missions, I think they quite often come down to a problem of first principles of economics, really, like not taxing external effects and not having true costs of technologies that you want to leave behind yourself. So it's often a matter of simply making the technologies that you want to overcome more expensive by taxing them, introducing CO2 prices, getting honest prices into the market. And I know, of course, that's also difficult politically to do, as we experience now. But it's probably more reasonable than spending copious amounts of money on projects, government money, on projects with all these political economic problems that we just heard about. And just solve the basic underlying problems by internalizing externalities. And I think, very innovative firms like Tesla, for example, they have come into existence probably due to the expectation that eventually government will tax carbon emissions very highly, and e-mobility will become a viable alternative to gasoline-driven mobility, and the mere expectation that regulation might change in the future already produces innovation incentives. So it's coming down to first principles.
Before I give the word to Maria, which I will do very, very quickly, I would perhaps like to remind that you have all touched, I think, in your presentations on the inherent problems of when the state tries to mastermind the direction of innovation, for example, through Mazzucato-like kind of mission programs and so forth. It comes with a certain risk of rent-seeking and rent extraction by interested groups and companies and well-connected political groups and so on. And the question is, I think I'm sure you would like to push back a little bit on what you heard, Maria, but is there a way, could you also come into the how can we see a way forward for the Mazzucato kind of policies that avoids these kind of seemingly inherent problems? Because I think you're all touched upon that is a recognized problem. Please.
Me?
Yeah, why not? You may also push back on what they said.
For them as well, so.
Sure.
I think that here the mission approach is actually a little bit interesting because you could formulate these missions more in the way that you do when you have this what we call målstyring in Norway, or steering by goals. That you set up, okay, you don't say that, okay, we should buy Equinor and use it for as a green transition instrument, but maybe we should, okay, if the challenge is to have a carbon neutral city or something like that, you could say that, okay, that's an open question. Here's the money. Here we invite in the private sector as well in a dialogue to say, well, what do they need? How do they propose to do this? And you can have different ways of doing it. Okay, it's not, but you, in a way, you say that, well, we will listen. We will not. And I think that the reason that you can have to do that, because as an economist, I completely agree with you. Okay, the best thing would have been to put a price on carbon, and here we go. And we have tried that for 30 years. And here we are. and I think that one reason here is that people actually have a very legitimate concern, that is that, well, what part will I play in this new economy? Where, okay, I see that my way of transport will cost more. I see that my job might disappear, but will there be another job? Will there be another way of living? And I think that this mission economy offers a way to kind of formulate a more positive vision or where we are going. And I think that the reason why politicians like this is that they need such an approach. And then you can say that there's a lot of pitfalls with that, but I think that this is also why people look to the mission economy.
Yes, Christian.
Yeah, I'll just like to first add a few things of issues and challenges with these top-down policies. Now, one chapter in our book is written by an associate professor at Lund, Anna Brattström, and it's about the entrepreneurship industry, where she basically describes how it has emerged in Sweden, an industry supporting entrepreneurship in various ways, and concludes that, you know, this is an industry in itself now that has emerged. And there are many such related industries once you put that big jar in place. So you're going to have firms specializing in applying for money from others, and they're going to skim off a little bit of that money. And then you have firms specializing in evaluating these great government programs. And these are private consulting firms selling their time, billable hour. Now, how do you think they're going to end up in their evaluations? Well, we have evidence of that in the book. 80% of those evaluations say it's been tremendous. 20% are kind of neutral, and then you see how that adds up to, so none of them being negative at all. So you get all these related issues. So building on sort of the more, where do we go with this? And I realize as we're talking now that a tax on something is actually a mission-oriented policy. And it's technology neutral. But it's politically very, very difficult to enact. And that's why it doesn't happen. So let's look at the cases where it has worked. So leaded gasoline is gone, okay? And a ban was imposed on leaded gasoline in the mid-1990s in Sweden. Before that, you've had various taxes on it for a decade preceding that. So leaded gasoline, lead emissions are down 98-99% in Sweden and most of the Western world. And I mean, it sounds traditional and boring, but impose legislation and taxes and then let the market follow and find its way. That is a form of mission, if you think of it. It's a boring piece of advice, but, you know.
Would you just like to say something?
Yeah, I mean, I see the point Maria has made, and I agree with it, that this mission economy story provides a very positive narrative. That's easy to sell politically, and that maybe even gives people some hope that sort of a new growth model might emerge out of government action there. But I think it's the art of politics, and politicians should be able to do this to provide a positive narrative also for things like CO2 taxes. And I think you can do this. You can sell CO2 taxes politically in a way that they lead to innovation, they lead to new technologies, they lead to an improved environment. So you can find positive narratives, positive rationales for these kind of policies also, and you can sell them politically. So, and I think professional politicians should be able to do this, really, if they really stand behind this. If you look closely at this mission economy as a positive narrative, it's really only that. It's only a positive narrative, and not much else. And that's the problem, because there's no real evidence that, on average, typically, this mission-oriented approach really works. There are always these few success stories that are brought to the front, but all the failures that you can also find, that you can read about in this volume, and there are many, many failures, they are never mentioned in the works of Mazzucato. It's always the positive examples. But if you look at the complete picture, the narrative isn't so positive at all. I think it's more or less a waste of money.
Well, as we can also, I think, recognize is that when we talk about and discuss these kind of issues, we easily get into the rhetorical landscape of active versus passive and positive versus negative and so on. And how should we actually evaluate what is active and positive or negative? And is it rhetoric or is it reality? Is it outcomes or is it intentions?
Well, it's outcomes.
Outcomes.
and most of all, it's not only outcomes, but it's the relation of resources invested to the outcomes. And if you have to invest massive amounts of public money to get some mission-oriented outcome that you can be proud of in the end, then the cost-benefit relation might not be so positive at all.
Yeah.
Any comments on the rhetorics and reality?
Evaluating these policies is difficult, sure, and counterfactual stories you like to have. I'm selling the book too very hard now, I know, but you know it's free for download. But we have one chapter where they employ a counterfactual case with a control group of firms, but in most cases and with these large sweeping missions, that is not possible to do. I think the opportunity cost needs to be taken into account when looking at it. Where would that money, where could it have been used? Now, also relatedly, the whole evaluation structure, the incentive structure around evaluations needs to be properly looked at. I would say one way is like in Sweden, the national auditor, Riksrevisionen. They need to be put in place, and they need to have strong independence, and they need to have a lot of academic muscle, so to say, to be able to pursue objective evaluations. This is not the case presently in Sweden. So those would be my comments. Yeah.
Maria?
Yes, I completely agree with you on the last of that chapter about the evaluations, and the evaluation economy is one of the very good chapter in the book, I think. But I just want to hear your perspective here, since you mentioned Tesla. I want to hear your thoughts about the Norwegian electric car policy. Because there you had, Norway was, I think, at a moment one of Tesla's biggest markets. So it's right that, okay, Tesla is a private company, Tesla is private technology, and they were gambling on regulations. But so far, an important part of Tesla's success has also been, I think, that Norway decided to create a market for electric cars, okay? And we did that with massive tax breaks and also building out infrastructure for chargers. And you didn't pick Tesla as a winner, but it was pretty obvious that Tesla would be one of the winners. And when it comes to, for example, emissions you have cut, that was very costly. Okay, you could have capped and traded and done it in some other countries much cheaper, but it achieved that green transition that we were asking for. So what do you think about that kind of politics?
I mean,
is it a success? Is it a failure?
You can put it into the context of a mission economy approach, if you want. Of course, you can tell it as a story of the government having this mission of furthering e-mobility and doing all these things on this mission. On the other hand, it could also be a very simple bread and butter story of correcting market failures, of, again, first principles of economics, and that's not a very spectacular narrative, of course. It doesn't sell so well politically, but it's just basic economics, correcting for the negative externalities of traditional mobility, not doing this only by a CO2 price, because that might not be politically viable, but looking at other instruments too, and correcting for these problems. So it's a matter of perspective in some sense. Is it really a grand mission-oriented approach, or is it just correcting for market failures in a very traditional way?
I think, Christian, you have some reflections.
Yeah, I go back to ethanol Jesus here and his gospel across the rural north and how we can make sense of, because I've been marveling at this. Norway went electric and quite consistently over a long time. And in Sweden, instead, 2003 and onwards, we blew that ethanol bubble. 20% of all cars in Sweden sold in 2008 were ethanol cars. 2 years later, that bubble crashes down because the engines, if you run them on ethanol, they don't work. So it all crashes down then a few years later. And we've been looking into this, and this goes back to Jan's point about regulatory capture. And policy making happens in an economic political context. Policy making is political. And in Sweden, you had something called the pump law, that a gas station ought to have a renewable fuel there. And that law was imposed. But when that law went out for interest groups to look at it, for some reason, it comes back with the statement, the gas station is to put any renewable fuel there that it wishes to be compliant with the law, except electricity. Except. So that exception just comes in there when this has been out, this law proposal with interest groups. So miraculously somehow that is excluded. And then, well, there is no other alternative there. You can pick anyone you choose as long as you pick black, you know. And everyone puts an ethanol gas pump in their gas station, and they are still there today, and nobody's using them. So Svenska Petroleum Institutet, and the fact that we have an automotive industry and a car manufacturer that starts with V and ends with Volvo. I mean, these things contribute to why we ended up running 10 years in the wrong direction. So policy making is political, is my answer. And it was perhaps political in the right way in Norway, you know.
Well, I'm tempted to say that we have heard that you had a ethanol Jesus in Sweden. We didn't have an equivalent in Norway, but we may have had an electric religion, and perhaps we're lucky with that. Now, we have other concerns as well, I think, with masterminding policies that setting the direction centrally for how the economy and how innovation specifically should proceed and develop. And some of those concerns are a basic knowledge problem. I think where are the limits to what politicians or any central agency, by the way, can know today about what the future looks like and should look like, specifically in terms of value creation and what are the most valuable or value creative products and businesses and processes that we will actually be have our living standard coming from in the future. There must be some limits to what that can be, which is another inherent problem with big ambitions on centrally state policies. Do you see any limits on that? For example, if I start with Maria on this one, there are limits, I suppose.
Sure. I mean,
where are they? Are they?
I mean, the electric car is a good example of limits, because here the government was able to think that, well, we can have cars that doesn't run on petrol, okay, but it was impossible to think that, well, maybe we shouldn't have cars at all. Maybe we should do something else with transport. Maybe we should have more trains, or maybe we should have more Zoom meetings, or maybe we should do something else. So that's a very good example of the limits of the political foresight, I think. But and I would say in general, that's a very good argument for the state, holding back and just give this tax-deductible research grants or something like that, okay? But the problem is, of course, that when the politicians are, in a way, creating the future with regulation or as customers in the market, then it's not so. Then you can say that, well, okay, they don't know, but they shape the future, and it's I think it's very difficult even more difficult maybe for private entrepreneurs to know how to go about this. If you are going to have, does it make reason to make net zero building sites, for example, to make electric vehicles in construction? That depends a lot. Does that make economic sense? That depends a lot on whether the politicians will enforce their pledge about creating net zero emission building sites or not. So I think that's the kind of catch-22. That we create this future together.
Should perhaps also say that we know Mariana Mazzucato, which is the name we cannot we have to think about her in this case. She actually tweeted yesterday, having started to read a book. So and she had this response back that she felt, I think, that's my interpretation, that it's been somewhat misinterpreted in the way that she's not in favor of old-fashioned state planning and picking winners. She's stressing that in her in her Twitter posting yesterday. So is there some kind of is she onto something that isn't final, or could there be some kind of a prospects of actually harmonizing some of the ideas of Mazzucato with market-conforming principles and ideas, more open-ended policies as well? Can we give her the benefit of some doubt? Christian?
I think what I learned from our discussion here, coming here is not only about, preaching and talking about a book, but it's about absorbing impressions and thoughts here. And the discussion here around that taxes can actually, when we talk about that and missions, a tax or imposing something of a price or a ban is a form of mission. For me, that would be a way to reconcile them. Now, if we go back to that comment from her, I think that, well, first of all, these are 32 different scholars contributing to the book, and perhaps one or two of them have been building a straw man, I don't know, but that all these different professors are just building a straw man argument around Mazzucato. I find it unlikely, but let's see. Let's see about that. But I think going back to the mission, and that it's hard to understand what the mission actually is. So if it's something that is vague in its nature, it's going to be what? Subject to interpretation. And then it's going to drift into different interpretations, which are then something different. So it's vague from the beginning, and it becomes something different in different settings.
Okay. Well, I think at this point in time we should open the floor for questions from the audience. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and I ask you kindly to stick to the following rule. Just a question, please, and just say your name and your affiliation, and a colleague of mine will be helpful giving you a microphone. Yes, start there. And
thank you. So my name is Elise Tingvoll. I'm a public affairs professional. I'm based in Brussels, so I follow very closely EU industrial policy. One of the sectors that I work closely with is the semiconductor industry. So obviously the new EU Chips Act is very important. And I think the important thing to know about this legislation is that it's a game changer in how we address industrial policy and state aid. Because for the very first time, the EU Commission is proposing state aid not just for R&D, but also for actual production manufacturing. And even the industry is quite skeptical to this sort of heavy market intervention. So my question is, for these sort of highly politicized and geopolitically important strategic sectors, how do we boost their competitiveness if it's not stated? What are the good alternatives, in your opinion?
would anyone like to pick up the question and with an answer?
Well, I can start. It's a very good question. I think your question illustrates that we're not only into green transition and state interventions there, but it's progressively more proactive industrial policies as you look ahead now. So this is a pressing issue, and I don't know, I think the solution often is worse than the problem. I mean, what they end up doing often is they're going to throw money at whatever they can throw money at. So it's going to be Intel instead of TSMC, which is the primary competitive actor. But TSMC, you can't get it. And then it's, well, we must do something, and this is something, so let's do it. And they go for something that does not work. And then when that is put in place 5 years later, it ain't going to work anyway, and then the world has run in a different direction. So the solution is sometimes it's tempting, and policymaking, they got to have a solution, but to the extent that you can collaborate with your partner countries in the Western world, I think that is the solution. But it's a pressing and complex issue, and thank goodness I'm not a policymaker, you know.
And I mean, you also wonder what the real effect of these subsidies is in the end, especially for building new capacities for production, as it happens in Europe now. I mean, we have a massive semiconductor shortage around the world right now, so market incentives for investing are extremely high at the moment, and they would invest massively even without subsidies. Maybe they wouldn't invest in Europe, maybe they would invest somewhere else, but they would definitely increase capacity. And is it really necessary to have a massive semiconductor production in Europe? That's, of course, maybe also a security policy question that not only touches on economics. But that has little to do with innovation then. And as I see it, the subsidies handed out now also have not that much to do with innovation, because they won't further the technology frontier to a very great extent, but simply increase production capacities. So for innovation, probably some completely different approaches in basic research, probably would be more suitable.
I think we have time for just 2 additional questions, and I noted that I think my colleague Steinar Juel you raised your hand? Oh, sorry. You first. Come on.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Truls Berg, and I'm the chairman of Open Innovation Lab of Norway, and also the editor of InnoMag. First of all, thank you for bringing up this topic. It's an important topic. I had a discussion with Maria 8 years ago up at Lerkendalskonferansen, so why took you so long? And also thank you for pointing out that Maria has been misused and misunderstood quite a bit by political leaders and lobbyists. My point is that some of the history here is kind of a bit wrong, because one of the reasons Norway was early on with electric cars was not because we were very visionary, but we were trying to save think. And because we were trying to save think, this corporation that came up with a very entrepreneurial guy, and he met a lot of closed doors back in the 1989 and 1990 and 1999, 1991 and 2 and every. So Elon Musk was one of the guys. He spent days here in Oslo learning from Jan Olaf Willums and the other guys about it, because they tried to do it and because they spent a long time doing it. Think was bankrupt before they got this into position. But my point is, it's one of the things that I think you mentioned in the book, and also what Jan is bringing up, is that this goes wrong mostly because most of the money goes to the existing businesses. So the money and the lobbyists are on the side of keeping status quo instead of joining the change makers. So how can we solve that? That's my question to you. How can we make sure that the political leaders more listen to the Jan Olav Willums in 1990? Okay. If we had done that, we would have been a mobile leader, we would have been an electrical car leader. We don't do that.
Okay, I think you stated your question, and I think we can just have one response to that. Would any one of you volunteer?
Well,
Well, I think that's a good question. Because how do you know that that the think in the 1980s was maybe the best way forward, and not another ethanol story? And that was why I think that kind of more research is needed. we actually need to understand this processes better, both the failures and what the thing we look more at as successful.
Just one point, maybe.
Another short, if we don't that. You're very quick.
If you want to do this, actually, then you probably have to depoliticize the process of handing out the money. Leave it to independent experts, and then, of course, you have the problem of de-democratizing it also at the same time, and then you're also in a completely different story again than the Mazzucato story.
We have one story in Sweden with telecommunications in the 1980s. You had a government monopoly, Televerket, and a private firm called Comvik contesting with mobile telephony, challenging the monopoly. Okay, now if you put billions up for grabs here to do innovation, who thinks it's going to have ended up with the small entrepreneur here? No one. No. So the solution here, why did it succeed in this case? You had a private entrepreneur with massive loads of money that he could pour in from other sectors of the economy. You need to accumulate large public wealth in an economy and private entrepreneurship. And it's a conventional answer, but yeah.
Okay. We have a question from our colleague from the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. Please, Isabel.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And first of all, thank you so much for very interesting input. I would like to ask, we have 3 countries which are very much linked, connected to each other in terms of economy, trade, and also partnership on innovation. So what could that mean also for the future? I mean, if you have these countries who are really building up a system of helping with agencies on innovation and so on. Does this make any difference to what you have just said, like the thing of maybe of finding hidden champions, and also what does it mean in the context of the Green Deal? I haven't heard too much about the Green Deal and its impact on this kind of policy. Thank you.
Lars Peder taught me yesterday over dinner that there was the Mazzucato report that was underpinning, preceding the entire Green Deal. So Mazzukato's thinking is all over the Green Deal. And I mean, that's a huge package, right? But the fact that you have so much money allocated for one specific technology, hydrogen gas. I've written pieces in Sweden saying that is hydrogen the new ethanol? And there are many inherent weaknesses with hydrogen as a technology that are hard to disregard. So I think we've been moving very quickly towards more of these policies that have a very weak track record, and I'm not very positive about it, no.
Yes, I think what we could do is that we have 3 countries here with very similar industrial structures, which rely on medium-sized firms to a great extent, which are, at least in the case of Sweden, very start-up friendly at the moment. And in Europe, on the European level, we have this conflict between a French-style planification, industrial policy, and the more market-oriented approach of countries like Germany, maybe Sweden, Norway. So probably the idea could be to commonly oppose the more French approach on the European level. That could be a fruitful venue of cooperation, I think.
Okay. And of course, Norway is not in the European
No, of course
Union
not.
properly, so I don't know if Maria would like to give a comment on as well. But we are cooperating a lot. So, would you add anything?
No, maybe a comment on the Green Deal that we haven't talked very much about. And I think the reason we haven't do that is that I agree with you that Mazzucato is taking a lot of of the honor for the Green Deal, but at the same time, I think that's in from the politician's perspective. It has another inspiration as well. That was the New Deal in the 1930s, and that's important to understand. I think that for what this New Deal did was that it was actually a kind of social project. Okay, it was a rebuilding of the economy where you said that you're going for more kind of inclusive growth. And I think that when politicians today are using this word, the Green Deal, and are looking for kind of Green Deals, that it's very much because they want a way to create such inclusive growth today as well, and the mission policy could be part of that. You could also have you could call it a Green Deal, that you have pricing of carbon, and then you take the revenues and you hand it out as a lump sum subsidy or something like that. So you have more redistribution, and you could also call that a Green Deal. But I think that the most important thing with the Green Deal seen from politicians in Europe or in the US for that sake is that it offers a way to combine social and employment issues with the green transition. And if you don't like the Green Deal, maybe you have to come up with another way.
Yes, thank you very much. In some way, this is beginning to sound like almost the last round of closing comments from the panel. And we don't have too much time left, but we do have, if we can make a short round, if you have some core conclusions or next steps that you think are important to say on the way forward on these themes, you are welcome to close with a short remark.
Very, very close. Successful policy should be broad and general, and not specific towards certain technologies or certain firms or industries. I think that is what I conclude a bit here from listening. but that is politically very hard to enact. And I think this comes from our discussion as well. I also take with me here that you can think of taxes or bans on certain chemicals, etc., as different kind of missions, saying we remove this now from the economy and you are to figure out different ways and solve your own problems. So to me that is perhaps a way to reconcile or combine the Mazzucato mission thinking with more conventional economic thinking.
Okay. Jan, would you like to
Yes.
make a short
Just
final statement?
Just very briefly, I think we always need to remind ourselves of the basic fact that market economies are successful because they make efficient use of dispersed knowledge. And believing that you can overcome this with a very centralized, mission-oriented innovation planning approach is, I think, false from the beginning. It doesn't fit to the concept of a working market economy. So you can't have both. You either have mission-oriented innovation policy or you have a working market economy, but you can't have both, probably, in the long run.
Okay, Maria?
Well, I think in Norway we say that we have a mixed economy. We have part market economy and partly a more state-oriented or social economy. And I think that I completely agree with you that there's a big risk for whenever the state does something, there's a big risk that it will be captured by vested interest. And in a kind of transition that we are in now, probably the state have to do something, just as it had to do when it met the COVID-19 crisis, for example. And then the question is what to do, how to go about doing this and getting your incentives right and getting the public with you on this. And I'm not sure that the mission economy, I think we all agree, offers the whole solution here, but I think that it might be helpful from a political perspective to think about in the way of what do you want to achieve here. And you could call that missions, you could call it something else, but I think that to formulate some kind of goals there, that is actually important. And if you don't do that, the risk of capture is very high.
Okay, thank you so much. Let me just finally say to you all that the book we have been talking about is available on open access basis, and you will even find a link in the Facebook posting for this event by Civita. So if you go back to that, and you'll find that. I think many thousand downloads has happened already, and one of those by Mazzucato, I suppose. And may I also remind you about another thing. This topic has many dimensions, and in Civita we have been writing quite a lot of articles and even papers on this, and you are welcome to visit our website, and you will find a lot of material there if you want to also dig into the positive side of things and what kind of policies that might be productive. So thank you so much. Shall we give the panel a good hand? Thank you. And thank you for your attendance and interest and questions. And I'm sure we are looking very much forward also to the next physical breakfast meeting at Civita. Have a nice day. Thank you.